Mountain, river, sky and sea are not really four different things, if they're things at all. A thing is defined by its edges. The influential American philosopher Edward Casey only last year published The World on Edge, stressing the importance of edges in our construction of understanding. The sky and the sea have no edges, nor do rivers. Does a mountain? The peak of the Matterhorn is a study in edginess for any mountaineer, but where in the foreground does the mountain end and the world begin? Where are the edges that split the Matterhorn from the other mountains? Summits are things. Mountains, like sea, like sky, like rivers, are constructions of our imagination. And every mountain, by its nature, is a place of rivers, and we define it by the distance its summit stands above the sea and approaches the sky. We know these are elements of a single phenomenon. But that demands that we transcend the separation in the words we use. Mountain, rivers, sea, and sky make an entity. We simply don't have a word that embraces this wholeness. But I will be talking about another culture with another language that does. But that's not where I begin. That's over 20 years ago in China. Wandering through a mountain village in Yunnan, I was struck by the text banners attached to many houses and managed to find the calligrapher. We spent an hour or so in wonderful conversation, made more wonderful by the fact that we didn't have a single word in common. Communication at a relatively simple level is not hard. He showed me his work and conveyed his regret at not having access to the images of European art that he wanted, particularly Picasso, who he deeply admired. Before I left, we wrote messages for each other awaiting translation after we parted. His was an extravagant gift on a silk scroll on which he painted 4 large characters. Yun, Shui, Tian, Chan. I apologize for the pronunciation. In the poem Piers Plowman, the illiterate Piers is given a document which is told is a pardon, and he tries to find someone to interpret it from Latin text to English speech. Each person who tries says something different, and it was the same with these 4 characters. Yuin may mean the province of Yunnan. Shui may mean flowing water, a river. Tian may mean sky. Shan, mountain. Mountain, river, sky, and Yunnan, but each word has ambiguity. Perhaps Yuin is a cloud. Tian may mean a great and powerful figure. Shui may mean a graceful woman. I discovered that the brushstrokes speak of the calligrapher. He loves Yunnan. One reading was that the rivers of Yunnan flow sweetly and its mountains are magnificent. Another was that the men of Yunnan are powerful, but its women are beautiful. Floating clouds and flowing waters fill the mountains, and that meant that the floating clouds and running water are a reference to itinerant Buddhist monks or Taoist recluses, because these two, in their pursuit of wisdom, move around leaving few traces. Mountains, rivers, sea and sky are given meaning by thought, by language. They are not things, but ways of seeing landscape. None of them have boundaries. None of them can be weighed or separated. People, us, make sense of them and shape them, and so shape ourselves. Landscape is alive with us. I'm going to take you now into the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia, where we can learn something that we really didn't know about the complex entity here that's made up of people, mountains, rivers, sky and sea. The Sierra is a roughly triangular mountain massif in northern Colombia, emerging from the Caribbean and rising from sea level on the other 2 sides, unconnected to the Andes. It's a small, distinct tectonic plate, which rises spectacularly out of the sea in just 42 kilometers to twin peaks over 5,700 meters high. Their exact height is still uncertain, as is the question of whether they have different heights. In the 19th century, the peaks were christened, of course, Cristobal Colón and Simón Bolívar, separating them conceptually from everything else and giving them the authority of conquest. The first ascent, according to the official records, was not until 1939. That, of course, ignores the existence of the inhabitants, who didn't come to the mountain, but came from it. The Kogi people are, by their own account, one of 4 indigenous groups of the Sierra Nevada whose ancestors are known from Spanish colonial records as Tairona. These communities emerged during the 17th and 18th centuries as distinct language groups sharing a common cultural framework and oral history. These are Arhuacos with their own language and costume, but who share the Tairona heritage. They all belong to the Massif, and they speak of the upper region as Go na Windua. It begins with Go, anticipation, continues Na, the pre-dawn light which we call astronomical dawn, then Win, the first movement of life in the womb, and ends in Dua. Dua meaning the burst of ejaculation across the heavens called the Milky Way, and also meaning every tiny form of life on Earth and in the sea, and a generic term for shells. Gonavindua is not a thing. It has no edges. It is the story of the quickening of the world. Of the 4 Tairona-descended groups, Kogi, Arhuaco, Wiwa, and Kanguama, the Kogi are the least acculturated, the most hidden. They're said to be the last indigenous theocratic chiefdom on the American continent. They regard Gonavindua as a single ecological structure, a biological entity, a living body, containing the internal and surface organs that sustain it. It has 36 rivers, many of which descend from glacial lakes to tropical mangrove lagoons, and their flow is regarded as serving the functions of blood, urine, bile, and other liquids within the body. Its forests and plants are necessary covering for its skin surface and are sometimes referred to as hair. Each individual part of the structure has its own life. Cutting down a tree is equated with taking a life, but that is within the larger context of the living mountain. But the way in which this body fits together, and their way of working with it, has come as a surprise to me after knowing them for over 25 years. I'll be setting out today the present state of my understanding, which I believe has considerable significance for understanding the way many other societies have worked with the landscapes they've inhabited, even perhaps including Wales. Like all indigenous people, the Kogi are primarily concerned with fertility. Ancestrally, they were remarkably successful at this. Estimates of the population of the Sierra in the early 16th century, when the Spanish first arrived, have recently risen to about 700,000. Today, this territory supports less than 1/10 of that number and requires a UN food assistance program. Here you can see the total disappearance of vegetation from one river valley, completely stripped bare by 1995. In 1970, it had been completely forested. The systems in use for land management before the conquest were much more effective than those available now. The Tairona lived at every level on the mountain, exchanging materials, seafood, resources, crops and fruit from the different vertically structured ecological zones, using well-crafted stone paths and stairways. The river valleys gave structure to this pattern and were inevitably linked to lineages. At the lower levels, Tairona lived in large settlements and farmed extensively. They were governed by warrior chiefs, who the Spanish called caciques, supported by spiritual leaders who the Spanish called naumas. These communities were violently attacked and destroyed in the 17th century. Their social structures were annihilated, and they were driven in scattered groups into less accessible and less fertile mountain regions, where they constructed new, smaller settlements. But they weren't colonized, and they retained their language. The communities we know today eventually formed under the guidance of a priesthood who the Kogi call mamas. These took over the duty of managing their communities in the absence of caciques.
The Tairona did not have, and still lack, a written language. Mamas, who are trained from infancy in virtual darkness for up to 18 years, are the repository and guardians of oral history, communal knowledge, and technical practice. They believe that it's their function to maintain the health of this ecosystem, and that we, who they call the younger brothers, are recklessly damaging it. In the 1980s, they decided that they needed to warn us about this, and that decision resulted in the extraordinary BBC documentary From the Heart of the World, The Elder Brothers Warning, which I helped them make and which was broadcast in December 1990, in time for the Rio summit. It had some impact, but of course little, if anything, actually changed.
Their communication was generally seen as being ethical rather than practical, insisting on the obligation of humans to care for the world as a living and feeling being, and esoteric, suggesting that they have a mystical or spiritual connection with the natural world that may be valuable but has no testable validity.
Humans need water. They have to have water to live. The earth is the same. It was made perfect by Saranqua, but now it is weak and diseased. The animals die, the trees dry up, people become ill. Many new illnesses will appear. There will be no cure or medicine for them. And the reason is that younger brother is violating fundamental principles continually and totally. Drilling, mining, extracting petrol, minerals, stripping away the world.
Though the Kogi's presentation had a powerful emotional appeal, and many people felt strongly that they needed to take it seriously, it had little to add to scientific and pragmatic understanding of environmental issues, or to distinguish it from the general perspective presented by indigenous people globally. Their message's weight lay in the Kogi's presentation of themselves. They had thought that we didn't know how much damage we cause, and their warning would inform us and change things. They did not think that we know and think about nature in a completely different way. They established their own exotic authority, but added little practical value to the green argument that built strength over the following years. They never addressed the question of whether they have any concrete understanding of ecological systems that is different from, and perhaps supplementary to, our own. The Kogi, more scared than ever, have learned that we rely on a different way of describing nature. They maintain that their understanding of cause and effect, which sees their territory as a single organism, is based on testable foundations, which are more truthful than our own fractured vision. They decided to try again. They want to place their advice on what we would see as a more scientific basis, and to engage in conversation with younger brother scientists. They set out to explain how they believe their own environment needs to be managed. So, in 2005, the collective leadership of the Kogi Mamas brought me back to try again, and set out to explain with a further educational documentary, which I helped them make over the next 7 years. The meeting we began with illustrates how different we are. This is up at around 3,000 meters, at a nodal point on the neural network of Gono-Indua. It's called an Iswama. The gathering is entirely of male and female shamans. The men are called mamas, the women sagas. The additional voices you hear are the sagas. They're speaking the same words as him. Seated on the ground, they speak with words coming from the earth, which are then declared by the mama. This is Gono-Indua calling.
We haven't spoken clearly enough to the younger brother. This situation doesn't only affect us, but everyone in the world, even the English on the far side of the sea. What is happening is a massacre of the sites.
An Iswama is a location with what the Kogi call authority. The same word means human political authority, but this is part of nature. It's also a place where humans and the world connect. Humans, in the Kogi perspective, are embedded in nature. And now they set out to explain how Iswamas function and what is going wrong. They place their narrative within the framework of what they call the Black Line, a territorial boundary that links a number of specific and significant sites. This Black Line is a relatively modern construct with a clear political purpose. It dates back to 1973, when the four peoples of the Sierra and the Colombian government defined it as the boundary of their traditional territory. They gave Gonavindua edges so that we could see it. A sequence of so-called sacred sites have been defined that are linked on the Black Line like beads on a necklace. For our film, the Mamas linked 19 sites on the Caribbean coast, using 400 kilometers of gold thread, walking the Black Line on the northern face of the Sierra. Black is a term with special significance to the Kogi. It's not a color, but a state of matter, and that state can be described as uncreated. Blackness is the condition of the world before it had been brought into material existence, when it was only thought in the consciousness of the mother. Creation was the separation or withdrawal of the mother. As one informant explained to me, there was a flat cloth. The cloth is uncreated, black, then a corner of the cloth was lifted, separating the cloth below from the cloth above. And in the newly opened space between was material reality, the physical world we inhabit, the present. This space is not the cloth, it's not filled with the mother's thought, but reveals a trace of it. The material world is illuminated. The whole cloth I was to understand as the whole of the mother's thought. The separation of below from above was the separation of the future from the past. But somehow the mother's thought still has to be accessed in this space from which it was withdrawn. That is the meaning, I think, of the original black lines. They are understood as invisible fissures, gaps in reality, where the mother may be directly accessed. Eswamas are nodal points on these lines. Each Eswama connects directly and invisibly with a site lower down, called a Nikuna. Each coastal site on the frontier line is a Nikuna, directly and invisibly linked to an Eswama. This is founded on an older tradition of black lines, which are radial, illustrated on this incomplete map. These seem to be river drainages descending from the highlands to the coastal sites. These radial connections are fundamental to the Kogi's activity of land management. The lines also correspond to lineages. The distinction between higher and lower, Eswama and Nikuna, is part of the cultural ecology of the Sierra. Families maintain farms at different levels and spend their lives walking up and down the ancient trackways, carry goods to exchange. There's no market in the Sierra, and until recently no currency. Instead, there's a morality of reciprocal exchange called Jingoneshi. This corresponds to similar systems that have been investigated in Andean history, but here we're taken right inside the way it works and the way people understand it. Jingoneshi is not just a substitute for trade. It is perceived as the process by which life functions, with natural movements of birds, insects, animals, and water, keeping everything alive. Everything is done in accordance with what we would call natural law, and they call se, the law of origin. This also controls the system of offerings made by the mamas. Up and down the Sierra, they're walking and making offerings. The offering system involves transporting materials from one altitude to another, just like food. They refer to these as spiritual food. This map shows the easternmost of the coastal sites, which are all identified as Hava, mother, or Hate, father, of a creature or activity, places of origin. We began the walk at Hava Shikaka, on the outlet of the Rio Acha. It's called the mother of the thread from which the cloth of the world was spun. It has been a locus of outlawry ever since Francis Drake seized it and armed its fugitive population. It is a Nikuna, and that word appears to include its Tairona population. It may mean subordinate or governed. Eswama signifies a place of government. It's the word now used by the Kogi for a government or political office. Each Eswama in the Sierra has an authority which extends through an invisible natural network and connects to a specific Nikuna on the coast. The Eswama, too, has a human element. Each Iswama is the responsibility of a particular lineage, and a resident mama devotes his life to its care. This is the mama of a site called Sejwa. He is a permanent part of the Iswama and can never leave. That spectacular bag indicates his position in the lineage. Just as lineages are attached to particular sites, so they believe are creatures. At one of the sites belonging to macaws, this gold macaw was found by a treasure hunter. The Kogi believe this undermines the viability of the creatures and explains their disappearance. This is a large stone at the entrance to the archaeological site Buritaka 2000, also called the Lost City. It appears to map connections between the nodes. A small manipulation performed at the Iswama can, they believe, have a direct and readily experienced effect at the Nikuna, miles away. The two locations are entangled, like a photon and antiphoton created in the same event, which then mirror each other in what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. But that may be an inappropriate analogy, since we're certainly not talking about events on a subatomic scale. It may be more appropriate to see this as a form of acupuncture. The Kogi understand all life in terms of balance between masculine and feminine. All features of the world are gendered, and imbalance has immediate physical consequences. The ancient Chinese theory of acupuncture has a similar philosophy of sexual complementarity, yin and yang, and claims that energy flows between them in the body along invisible channels. The energy, called qi, has to follow a specific pathway, and a small interference in its flow by the insertion of a very fine needle can correct an imbalance at its destination. The Kogi management of nature using Iswamas could be appropriately described as earth acupuncture, especially as they regard the land itself as a living body. At this Iswama, mamas do their work on ancient stone seats by the river. Mama Shibalata explained, Iswamas collect with the shore, they connect with the sea, and they have authority over everything. It's a hot spot, a meeting point. Its power reaches over the sea and the mountains. It's always been this way. We visit Iswamas to make offerings to the mother in the mountains and along the coast. Those offerings, represented by fragments of leaf, of cotton, of shell, held between thumb and forefinger, are the focus of a tremendous concentration. The Kogi understand the cosmos to be rooted in a single consciousness which underpins space and time. This is Aluna, and all physical reality is, in their view, the manifestation of ideas conceived in Aluna. That is what Mama Shibalatu referred to as the mother. So the job of the Mama is to strive to comprehend, by concentration and observation, his place in the laws that shape reality. He participates in the laws of nature. An Iswama is a place which they believe is connected through the operation of natural laws to another distant place. There are visible connections, such as watercourses. There are also invisible connections, such as underground flows, air currents, the movement of birds and animals, and so on. For the film, their specific illustration of the connection was an Iswama where the environment showed signs of serious damage, attributable in their view to damage done at the Nikuna below. The lower site had been used to construct a coastal power station, Thermo Guajira, commissioned in the 1980s. The operation of the plant had resulted in the drying out of the mangrove swamp around it. This is the estuary of the Rio Ancho, which comes down from the Sierra. It is dead. The Kogi call this site Have Shikaka, and say it once had about 30 channels, corresponding to all the river valleys of the Sierra and connected to them. These were places of offerings connected to the entire massif. They have been eliminated. The power station has drained the Rio Ancho. Up here at about 2,000 meters, they took me to the associated Iswama, next to the river. Their purpose was to show how damage below had caused damage above. The effect of the power station had been in effect to accelerate the river flow, causing torrents and landslides, and draining the source lakes of the river in the high tundra at about 4,500 meters. The flow then fell away greatly, and significant changes are now occurring to the vegetation around it, including the death of an ancient huge cocoa bush, which they regard as central to their culture, and also the death of the mama that took care of the site. When they presented this information to Professor Herman Galvis of the National University of Colombia, there was no meeting of minds.
No hay ninguna circunstancia que traslade ese efecto hacia arriba. El efecto hacia abajo es lógico, lo traslada el agua. Entonces, muchas cosas, la erosión, la deforestación, las partes altas, tienen efectos sobre las partes bajas, pero lo contrario no es muy evidente. Es más, no es evidente desde un punto de vista. Bueno, pero no explicó en qué forma ocurre. Es decir, la conexión de las lagunas de arriba a las de abajo es obvia. El agua corre hacia abajo y el agua lleva cosas. Pero, ¿qué lleva las cosas de vuelta de las lagunas de abajo a las de arriba?
Bueno, hoy, sin que van, hoy, hay que hapiafana, hay que guanana, hapiafana, como de tu cosa de nada. Messi. Sakinazi nadat mi hanzi geigaha ni khanda zeguha mi hanzi ni ranki hay huyardok mi hanzi zeni ranki ni hay alen tunkaki mi hanzi jini ni zabira tocha hay haba kijuka huya hawa shenta abuje baka abuje gatsai ijogin hay ni ranki hay sopak pam kani ranki atami miang kageiga kageiga shaka haba kijuk kaiga hayne alen kaiga awoga no ka gini china jini ke hay ki mijel no hanak bone no ke eka hui goga kaka gitin gaini kahui je kabaka hui ji tuba gitin go gucha zengar de gejak.
In this particular example, it's a commonplace that rivers depend on a water cycle involving evaporation, clouds, and precipitation. Less commonplace is the Kogi's contention that the water cycle is tied to specific localities. That's why the drying up of a river's source is explained by the disappearance of a specific body of water at the river's mouth. This reflects the most modern work on creating a synthesized, holistic understanding in which rivers are not analyzed as things in themselves. Understanding riverine ecosystems has had direct practical results, such as removing canalization from estuaries to revive river headwaters. They chose this example, thinking no doubt that it would be reasonably easy for us to understand, and were encouraged by subsequently meeting Professor Alex Rogers, a climate scientist from Somerville College, Oxford, who fully endorsed their understanding of estuary damage, and holding a Skype call with Jonathan Bailey of the Zoological Society of London on sites that govern species.
In conservation, we have a problem because we tend to conserve an area without much thought to the special places in a geological time scale. So for species, there are areas that are like a refuge, which through geologic time have been extremely important for them to survive. And on the short term, we may remove these areas, and there may be no big effect. But in the long term, through history, the species can't persist when those special zones have disappeared.
The Kogi men's meeting houses are built with the architecture of the cosmos. The rings around the roof are the 9 worlds, the 9 planets, the 9 months of gestation, all descending from the central cross on which the world stands. It's also, of course, the mountain. They are inside Gonavindua, which contains life, landscape and law. It connects rivers, sky and sea on a systematic basis. The idea of original law, se, is fundamental to Kogi science and ethics. They understand all nature to be subject to se, and it is the job of humans to work according to se in nature and society. That includes an obligation to repair damage done by human action. That work begins here in the World House, the Nuwe. Their work restoring degraded forest, rivers and habitats in the foothills appears to be surprisingly effective. One particular example is in the Waichaka River Valley, which was devastated by lowland deforestation and inefficient farming, and then purchased by the indigenous people. The river had almost dried up, the animals had disappeared. Over 20 years they've restored the forest, increased the river to a healthy volume, and seen the return of animal life. This involves both the physical work of planting and gardening and the process of making offerings at the appropriate high elevation Eswama, which is directly connected with a Nikuna lower down. Eswamas and Nikunas are generally called sacred sites, sitios sagrados, when communicating with Colombians. This was a mass indigenous protest to try to prevent the destruction of a hill at the mouth of the Rio Ancho. It's called Habahukulwa and is primarily concerned with childbirth. To them it was the equivalent of demolishing a dam, but no one believed that. Sacred has no equivalent in Kogi, but they know it means untouchable to us, so this protest was framed in our mystical language of the sacred. They were talking about natural law, cause and effect, but know that we can't grasp what to them are obvious facts, so they say the land is full of sacred sites. The mystical language, which we behave as if we understand, obscures their central belief that there is a real connection between specific lower and upper sites, which is manifested in such things as underground water flow, evaporation and precipitation patterns, and the sustenance of plants and animals, so that elimination of an estuarine lagoon can dry up a glacial lake, because what has gone down must come up. They tried to explain the process that would kill this huge region of coastal mangroves, but were reduced to speaking about sacred places, which gets nowhere. Understanding Eswamas and Nikunas, and knowing that what goes up must first have come down, was an important part of sustaining 700,000 people. The Kogi extend the idea of black line linkage within the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta to all mountains. Currently, one Mama Senchina, has been visiting surviving Muisca communities on the Altiplano of the Colombian Andes, where he reports he's found the Eswama system is still remembered and locations can be identified. This site, near Villa de Leyva, high in the Andes, halfway between the Sierra and Bogota, is now described as a Muisca observatory, but it's clear from Spanish records that it was a ritual and offering site. Was it an Eswama? Mama Senchina is on a mission to work with the Muisca to restore the health of the land by restoring traditional land management. Muisca culture, which flourished for thousands of years on the high Andean Altiplano, depended for its sustenance on lower regions, and they made offerings at sites at different levels with what looks like the same idea of what I'm calling earth acupuncture. That does raise the question of the meaning and function of the artificial mountains that so many cultures have created around the world. The Mayan sites are obvious candidates for this interrogation. The pyramids of Tikal, which it's now thought were surrounded by an artificial lake, are possibly to be interpreted as sites which carefully link upper and lower to manage the land around. Mama Senchina Skyped me early in May to say that Mexican Maya had taken him to the Great Pyramid of Teotihuacan and shown him what they regard as an Iswama, not on its top, but deep inside. A number of archaeologists, including Bill Sillars of the Institute of Archaeology, have suggested the similarity between the Iswama-Nicuna lines and the Inca system of 42 ritual lines radiating from Cuzco in Peru, examined by Brian Bauer in 1992 and known as seques. These have some 328 shrines dotted along their length and are believed to have been walked as ritual paths, and some are still used that way. This is not just applicable to Gono Indua. Arhuaco leaders urge that for that reason they should present their argument from a different mountain, one known to its people as Goddess Mother of the Land, Chomolungma. They wanted to show that the indigenous people of Everest once managed their land according to the same ideas. But that should not mean climbing to the summit as the Arhuaco proposed. Ascending the summit of Chomolungma or Gono Indua is traditionally forbidden. It's dangerous for the mountain and for the world. This is the cue of trekkers making their mark on the 16th of May this year. And this is what they leave behind. 50 tons a year. The concept throw away is meaningless. You can throw things up, throw things down, but where is away? This is the most obvious evidence of the climber's achievement. Only the climber has gone away, together with the red panda and the snow leopard. Obviously, the belief system of the Sherpas has been shaped by Buddhism and by their relatively recent migration to this part of the Himalayas, but conversations between some of them and the Mamas indicate that their bayuls, or so-called sacred valleys, involve the use of apparently similar practices to the Tairona to sustain fertility. In pre-Buddhist China, mountains were places for offerings to sustain harmony between material and non-material existence. They were later considered sacred by association with particular deities, but a tradition of making offerings to mountains, waters, and the earth of China, Tibet, and Mongolia continued. This is a Mongolian shrine called an ovo. The Mongolians still regard digging into the earth as a forbidden act, and the Mongolian shaman who advises the president of Outer Mongolia shares the Kogi view of nature and how to hold it in balance. We spent a remarkable time together in his ger, the felt equivalent of a nuhue, outside Ulaanbaatar. It may be useful to consider whether the black line concept of ecological harmonization has application in the practices of societies far beyond the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, and that might even include a society quite close to home. This, as I'm sure you all know, is the Preseli Mountains, now called slightly dismissively the Preseli Hills. This was once an area of ritual activity of unknown meaning, and of course this has now been confirmed as the source of the famous blue stones of Stonehenge. They were quarried around 5,300 years ago. 300 years later, they were taken from wherever they'd been installed to Stonehenge, 140 miles from their origin. This colossal expenditure of time and effort by what we suppose was a primitive society can have had just one primary purpose: to connect a place on Salisbury Plain to a mountain in Wales. Kogi did come and explain it all to me. He felt quite at home. He was touching petrified ancestor figures who understood that what comes down from the mountain always sends something back up, and who'd been waiting too long for their food. Mountain, river, sky, and sea are not really four different things.